In this video, I want to cover the major content of the Bible, show you how it divides and in this video, I want to show you some basic information about how the Bible is put together. Since the Bible is our focus of study, I think it's important to have some basic information about how the Bible is put together. It's different sections and different genres. The interesting thing is that the Bible is a collection of different books written by different people from different walks of life, from different times, from different locations. But it has a unified story of how God is working to save mankind through Jesus Christ. And so it exhibits a great deal of unity, even in the midst of the diversity that it does have. But this information will help you have a framework for understanding where you're reading, what you're reading. This won't be a major part of what we're going to cover in the coming days, but this is a good starting point for understanding the Bible and for thinking through how it works. So what I want to do is to walk you through what's here on the slide, and then to give you a framework again for understanding what you're reading, where you're reading, and giving you a better understanding of the organization of the Bible as a whole. Now you'll notice that the Bible contains 66 books total, 39 from the Old Testament and 27 from the New. Within the Old Testament, there are 5 major groupings that the books fall into. You will notice that I have grouped them together as the Pentateuch, as history, as poetry, the major prophets, and then the minor prophets. The New Testament also has some groupings, but there's a couple of different ways we could slice it out. You'll notice that there are Gospels and history, and then we have letters, 13 of which were written by Paul, and then 8 of which were written by others. And then we have the book of Revelation, which is in essence in a category by itself. But let me talk through each of these categories and give you some insight into them. Within the Old Testament, as I've said, there are 5 different categories that we focus on. And they are the Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is what many people will call the law, because in it, God gives his law to his people. He makes a covenant with Moses and with Israel and gives them the particular commands that they are to follow. And those books in many ways are foundational. They help us understand who God is, how he has created the world, how he is working to redeem the world. It's the initial foundational story that the rest of the Bible explains. The second category in the Old Testament is what we call history. Now, it doesn't mean that these books don't contain theology. It doesn't mean that they don't teach us truths about who God is and how he is at work. But primarily, these are written as historical narratives. That goes from Joshua all the way to the book of Esther. These books cover a wide range of time. Joshua's very early, Esther's very late, but these are in essence the history of God's people during the time of the Old Testament. The books of poetry are called such because of their content. Each of these books tells what it's telling in a poetic and dramatic and rhetorical way. Now, it doesn't, again, mean that these books don't have historical elements. It doesn't mean that there isn't a theological lesson to be learned. But these books primarily speak in poetic ways. And this really impacts how we interpret them. We have to understand how poetry works before we can understand these particular books. And we'll actually have a chance to think about this when it comes to interpretation. We'll talk about language and how poetry works, and that will give us some insight into understanding these books. Now, the next 2 categories of the Old Testament are very similar because they both deal with prophets, but they are divided because of the length. Major prophets are very long writings by particular prophets of the Old Testament. So major is not in terms of importance, it really is in terms of length. So we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Lamentations is a fairly short book, but it's joined with Jeremiah because it's written by the same author. So these are the larger writings of the prophets within the Old Testament. The minor prophets, there are 12 of them. They're not minor because they're unimportant. They're minor because they're simply shorter. For example, the book of Obadiah is just one chapter. And so it's not meant to be a statement on their importance and a statement on their value. It's just that they are shorter, and therefore they were grouped in a different way. So these 39 books together in these 5 different categories of Pentateuch, history, poetry, major prophets, and minor prophets constitute the Old Testament. Now, going over to the New Testament has 27 books. I have divided the books in the fashion as you can see on the screen, but there are some legitimately other possible ways to do this. But I think that this is pretty logical. The Gospels are the 4 books that tell us about the life and ministry, the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the books that tell the very stories of how Jesus was incarnated, how he lived, how he taught, how he died, and how he was resurrected. They are basically the books about Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that other books aren't about Jesus, but they're the ones that tell his life and story as he lived and died and was resurrected in the first century. The second category is called history, primarily because the book of Acts is meant to be a historical narrative of the early church. Now, the Gospels are also historical narratives because they tell us about the life of Jesus, but they are focused on a very particular person, and so they are in a category by themselves. The book of Acts details the history of the early church, and it's a lot more far-reaching. It has several major people that it discusses. It goes through a wide geographical area from the people of Israel, or the land of Israel, to the city of Rome. So it's considered in a class unto itself because it's a broader history of the early church. The letters in the New Testament number 21, and the Apostle Paul wrote 13 of those. By letters, we mean a particular correspondence from a particular individual to another individual, or in many instances to a particular group of individuals in a church. And understanding that is really pretty helpful because it gives us a sense of the structure of the writing, the things that the author was attempting to accomplish. It helps us interpret the genre a little bit better. But the Apostle Paul wrote 13 letters, and then other people wrote 8 other letters. Now, you'll notice in that other category that there are 2 letters by Peter and 3 letters by John. So we don't have that many authors, but there are 8 other letters within the New Testament in addition to the 13 letters of Paul. Now, the book of Revelation is an interesting category. I have called it apocalyptic because it involves what we call apocalyptic imagery and writing to convey the truth that it wants to convey. Now, some people, if you've seen other schemes about how the New Testament is divided, might use a different word, and that's perfectly okay. Some people prefer prophetic, for example. But I prefer the word apocalyptic because I think that encapsulates well the imagery of the book, the forward-looking revelation of it, etc. So that's the category that I have chosen for this particular book of Revelation. So when we put it all together, the Bible gives us 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New, and they are grouped in particular ways that help us understand their content. The Old Testament has the Pentateuch, history, poetry, major prophets, and minor prophets. The New Testament has Gospels, history, letters of Paul, and then other letters, and then apocalyptic in the book of Revelation. My encouragement to you is that you would think carefully about this chart so that you could identify a particular book that you are reading as whether it is in the Old Testament or the New, and which category it is in. Once you understand these categories, which we'll do partly as we go through the lessons on interpretation, that will help you understand how to read and understand what's in front of you. So this is a taxonomy, a categorization scheme that gives us insight and helps us read more efficiently and properly. So I would encourage you to put this to memory. I'm going to post this in the class resources so you can download it and refer to it. But it's a great starting point for your Bible reading because it gives you a sense of the organization of the Bible as a whole, and then you'll know where you are when you're reading in any one particular book.